Hey gang, hope everyone's worlds are well today. We are back with another episode of Instructional Designers in Offices Drinking Coffee, brought to you by the team here at Domino. Paul and I are both members. And this week we have a special guest with us, Sarah Mercier. Sarah, there are maybe some folks who haven't met you at conferences or seen sessions that you've done, etc. So take a few minutes to introduce yourself to our folks here today.
Well, hi, I'm Sarah Mercier. I run a company called Build Capable, a learning technology company, and we've been around since 2008, and I have been a guest on this show over the years for a lot of different topics. But one that we're going to talk about today is super important. I'm very excited about it, and I think we should get into it. I think we should talk about all the things today. I'm very excited.
Very good. Well, what we brought you in here today to talk about was the new book from ATD that you put out into the world, Design for All Learners. Ooh, there it is. Visual aid. Nice.
It looks intimidating. It looks more intimidating than it is. For those of you who aren't seeing it, it is about 600 pages. It's pretty thick. It's about an inch in or so thick. It's a big book. A lot of writing. But that's because the print is big. It's in color, so the pages are thicker. But the way that it's set up, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point today, is actually very, very accessible, as it should be.
So, like, my reaction to that was it's twice as thick as I expected. In terms of stuff. Now, you were the editor of the book, so you brought together a whole bunch of folks, to contribute to that. How many people in total?
So 25 plus me, so 26 including me.
Nice.
A lot.
No kidding. Now, how did you bring all of those folks together?
Oh, I love this question. So over the years, I've done design and development work my entire career. And I started really focusing on accessibility probably about 12, 13 years ago. And when I really started diving deep into accessibility, and if you have a copy of the book, you'll read my story. So you'll kind of see or read my whole journey. But when I started, I learned a lot about digital accessibility, classroom accessibility, that kind of thing over my career. And I'd say about 10 to 12 years ago, I really started diving deeper into ensuring that whatever I built was accessible to people. And throughout that process, I met a lot of really cool people, right? I would follow different people, learn from folks. The accessibility community is fantastic. And so when I started to put the book together, I put it together from the perspective of a designer / developer / leader in the L&D space. And what are the things that you need to know from those different perspectives? So I put together an outline, and then I started to plug in people I thought would be awesome to write certain parts, stories that I'd heard over the years, examples that I'd heard over the years. So I started to write people in. And I thought, and some people were my big goal people, where I was like, oh, I hope that this person will write something for the book. And I didn't anticipate that they necessarily would. I was very nervous because some of these folks I did not know personally. And I started to reach out to people, and I was shocked. Everybody said yes that I talked to. And so I started to plug people into the outline, had discussions about what we were trying to do and the structure of the book, and went from there. It was awesome. I definitely fangirled over some folks that are in the book and some folks that endorse the book for sure.
Very cool. Yeah, what a rush of adrenaline it must have been every time you opened an email reply from someone that you had shot a message off to. Very cool.
It was. And these people are so amazing. Like the folks that are in the book are incredible. And the book is split. So about half or maybe a little over half of the people in the book really are accessibility experts or advocates. And then the other authors or contributors are folks that are like me, that are designers, developers, leaders that had situations that happened and they had to handle it and what they did and what they learned from it. And so it was a very interesting project because folks were very vulnerable in what they shared and both the mistakes that they made or things that had happened to them personally, because there are several folks, actually quite a few folks in the book that have disabilities. And they share their personal experiences about different impacts and how they handle it from the perspective of having that disability. So it's really interesting to hear their stories, but also I was so honored to have the opportunity to share their stories in the book as well.
Mm-hmm. And how long ago did you start down the path for this project?
This is a good question. Actually, this book was imagined back about, now it's probably 6 years ago. And I write about this in the book. There was a keynote that Brian Dussablon did a long time ago. I think it was back in 2013 that I'd gone to, called Design for All, which is a UI approach, a user interface or user experience approach, technically more UX than UI. And that keynote, I learned a lot from him about seeing things differently from an accessibility perspective. And so after that, I had a relationship with the folks at ATD, and I told Brian, you need to go write a book about this. This is something that people need to know. They need to see it through this perspective. And so he had kind of put some stuff together. And then Haley Schust, who is in the book also, actually both of them are, she had come to work for my team and she was super passionate about accessibility. And I said, hey, you and Brian should work on the book together. And so I kept pushing folks to please, somebody write this book. It needs to exist. And so ATD was super excited. Fast forward a couple of years later, it kind of fizzled out. Nobody really knew how to approach the book. And the reason for that is because you cannot write this book one person. It can't, it doesn't work. And it's also a very hot stove topic. It's a challenging book to write. And so fast forward a couple of years later, ATD had reached out to me and they had talked to Diane Elkins. They had talked to a handful of people and said, what do you think about how could we approach this book? ATD had gotten to the point where they were going to write it themselves. They were just like, this book needs to exist. We can't find anybody to do it. So I talked to them and I said, look, I'll do it. But if I do it, this is the way I want to do it. And I want to make sure that different people's voices come through in this book. And I think the only way you can write this book is being able to learn from all these different folks' perspectives. Because if I had written it, it would be a different book. You would get the same technical advice, but without the context from that perspective. So
very cool.
Yeah, that makes me think, when talking to people and they're learning accessibility. And of course, invariably they go out to the WCAG site and sometimes they have examples and put them in there. But even I've worked with folks who they're like, well, there's radio buttons here. Therefore, and of course there's context around that, just like there's all the things as well as experience on it. I was kind of thinking, and I was starting to get a picture. So thank you for kind of sharing a little bit about that book. Of what the structure is, but maybe you tell us a little bit about, hey, if someone read that, gone through the whole book, either over time or once there, what are some of the things that you hope or you would expect that they would walk away with in terms of experience? Some people go into it, the thing is like, hey, I want to know how to technically make sure my content is accessible.
Yes.
Some people go as like, I don't even know if I'm aware of this or whatever.
Yeah. So this book, and I know you all had Susie Miller on, which makes me very happy. She's in the book as well.
Oh, great.
Oh, right
One
on.
of the things that I love about the way that this book is structured is how you can come at this knowing nothing, or knowing very little, or thinking you know, and not actually realizing how much you don't know, which is what I actually got from this book, is just realizing how much more of a journey this is. You don't So when you just pick up a checklist or, a tool, those things are super important, don't get me wrong. Like, you have to have tools to implement these things. But when you do that without all the context of why you're doing it, it just seems it's time consuming. It seems like you don't really get why you're doing it. And to your point, sometimes you'll end up making the wrong decisions because what is accessible for some folks isn't for others.
Hmm.
And so whenever you think about design for all, it's having this inclusive mindset to think about how you're designing it for people rather than doing it after the fact, being like, oh, do I have closed captions? Do I have a transcript or whatever? Well, yes, you should have a checklist and have those things, but how you set up your transcript and how you set up your closed captions, there's a lot to why you do things the way you do. And so this book is meant to bring you into understanding the why, like understanding why you do different things and how that impacts people, and the way that you can improve your designs to serve more people. Because this isn't just about folks with disabilities, right? It's about everybody. Whenever we start to make these things more accessible, it improves the experience for everyone. And in some cases, there have been times where I wasn't able to access something because it was not set up to be accessible and without me having a disability, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to do with having disabilities. It has to do with access. Now, for folks with disabilities, that could be a complete barrier, right? So when I think about the structure of the book and what you would take away, it really depends on what your goal is, because you can go into this book. There are multiple parts of it. So it starts with mindset, right? What does it mean? Like things, demystifying things like DEIB and JEDI and like all of the acronyms that now have become politicized, which is silly, but it demystifies what those mean and what that shows up in your work and why we do it. And then we talk a lot about like, what is accessibility? What is universal design? What is UDL, universal design for learning? So kind of like, what are all of the things that you hear and what do those actually mean? Because they don't mean the same thing. And then you get into kind of some of the stories about at a higher level that really blow your mind. It makes you think about accessibility totally different. So that's the first part of the book. And then there are a few parts of the book that are based on different types of training modalities. So in-person training in the classroom, virtual in-person training like this, right, where you're meeting over virtual tools, digital experiences, which is where Susie Miller's entire book really focuses, right? If you're doing e-learning, that is a book you need to implement these things. The digital chapter in this book is really to help you understand the why at a high level about what it is that we're doing for different reasons. And then you get into standards and laws, and that it's a primer. It's short. It's really understanding like, what is WCAG? What are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, right? What are the different laws, not just in the US, but throughout the world? Because Canada has some great laws. So does the European Accessibility Act. Like there are some really great regulations and laws and guidelines globally that help us better understand how to meet the needs of more people, which is fantastic. But there's a primer on those. And then you get into organizational implementation, right? So what does it mean if you're a leader and you need to make sure that you have teams or you have processes in your organization that are set up to support this? Because this cannot be one person doing this.
Mm.
And the book is a great example. Me writing this book and putting this together, if the editing team, the publishers, the contributors, if people don't know how to do, any kind of print publication or digital publication accessibility, it was a big learning experience. Fortunately, I got to work with a fantastic team of people, and I actually wrote about this in an article that I can share. So that's a big part of the book, is organizational implementation. And then we leave off with what's going to happen when you start doing this, because the kind of steal my own thunder is that you will end up messing up, and there will be people who get mad at you. And so it's like, what happens when you start taking action? You can have the best intent and be trying really hard, and sometimes people are going to be frustrated that you didn't do something the quote unquote right way. And so it's kind of, how do people handle those types of situations? And that's one of my favorite parts of the book, because Meryl Evans talks about, as a person with a disability, she messes up. She talks about how, like, how do you handle those types of situations? Because even folks that know still aren't perfect. So it's a really great structure, because you can jump in at any point and, read a chapter on any section of the book that you want. It's really meant to be read in whatever way you want.
You go where you feel the need is, and then presumably then you have a great resource for when the next set of needs come up too. Yeah,
that's right. Now you can read it end to end. I've done it 28 times.
Yeah.
And it's
but that's because you were looking for commas out of place and typing.
No, I had to read it every time, because remember what I was talking about, writing the book is a practice of accessibility. Mm-hmm. Every time that we went through a round of publishing, I had to reread the book in context to make sure that none of the editors that were after us, even after, the ATD folks that I was working with, they didn't inadvertently change words that I needed them not to change. And you can't do that unless you read it in context. So I have literally read this book 28 times at least, because you have to actually read it.
Yeah, I think about the context and, simple awareness and changing that perspective. In some of the presentations I've given on accessibility, I've used a really great video from a French group that said, to understand the world, and you're in this world, and for example, you go up to a phone, they're all lower because they were designed for people in wheelchairs. You go into the library, every book is in Braille, and these different things there. Mm-hmm. Kind of made me think of, just the awareness and as you mentioned, executive buy-in and the other folks. Maybe you could share a snippet of a story or two that really had an impact on you, or maybe prompted you to write the book, or all of a sudden you discovered this one, you knew they had a good story, but you didn't hear it till later, and it really made you personally rethink some things or reassess.
Yes. So one thing that I will say, because when you just said that, it made me think of something. I will go ahead and share with you all. This is not in the book. This is something that I saw after writing the book from another one of my accessibility advocates, one of my heroes, I guess I should say. Yes. Her name's Haben Girma, and she is a lawyer. She went to Harvard Law School. She's also deafblind. And she she talks about having gone to Harvard and how inaccessible going to Harvard was, and then some of the changes that they made and things like that. But she has this recorded interview where she talks about making accommodations. And she says, it's interesting that we talk about accommodations like they're only for people with disabilities. Because if let's say you're a wheelchair user, and you show up to an event, you show up to a conference. Well, you have your own chair, right? You don't need a chair, but they've made accommodations for all of the other folks that needed a chair. So they've bought rented chairs, put out chairs for all the folks who needed a chair to sit down. But if you're a wheelchair user, you don't need that accommodation, right? If you are blind, you don't need the lights on. So she was like, turn off the lights, you save electricity. I don't need that accommodation, right? If I'm blind. So accommodations are not just for folks with disabilities. And when you think about what we talk about when we talk about making accommodations, it's like, I don't want to make an accommodation for so-and-so because it's expensive. Are you kidding me? What makes your accommodation of needing a chair or the lights or whatever more important than this person's accommodation, right? And so to your point, and the library being all books filled with Braille or all of the low phone booths, like those types of things when we think about it, the world is designed for a certain type of person. And so I think that's a really big point, that if you want to like understand the tone of this book, it's stories like that. It totally flips your thinking on how you perceive accessibility and inclusive design and that kind of thing. Another thing that I think, this is a myth, and I'm gonna, if I could read just a short little excerpt of the book.
Oh, please.
So this is Leah Holroyd. She runs a company called White Bicycle. She's in the UK, and I actually met her through, I believe it was Susie Miller introduced me to her. She is incredible. She's an e-learning developer and designer, right? And so she also has macular degeneration. Now, she talks about going to a large technology conference. I imagine you can figure out through this story which one it is, but I won't say. So at a large educational technology conference in London, I approached the exhibition stand of a company whose software I use to create e-learning courses. So I imagine you can also guess who this software is. I introduced myself to the company rep and explained that I have a condition that affects my central vision. I told her that I experienced issues when using the software because some user interface elements were inaccessible. For example, the program's checkboxes or radio buttons were a very pale gray on white background, meaning that the color contrast was very low. The rep listened and nodded sympathetically, but offered no reassurances. She told me that the company's roadmap for accessibility was focused on the learner experience, meaning the end users of the e-learning courses. They had no plans to improve the experience for customers like me until they'd met all the web content accessibility guidelines for the learner-facing output. I couldn't help feeling that there was an underlying assumption here. Someone with a visual impairment probably wouldn't be working as a learning designer. Now, that is why I wrote this book, because we have this assumption that people who have disabilities are in some way less capable than folks who don't have that certain disability. We also have an assumption that most people don't have disabilities. Right? We also have an assumption that because you can't see it, that it's not a disability, that it doesn't affect you. And so when I learned about stories like this, it made me rethink everything. It's like, we need to make this content accessible to learners. Well, is the platform accessible to use? Which influenced how we designed XCL at Build Capable. Because remember, I'm a learning technology company. I build this stuff. And when we put together that tool, we designed it to be accessible from the beginning, because I thought about the people who would use the tool, not just what the tool produced. And that is a huge takeaway for me from this book that I may not have even thought about before, because I just never thought about it, right? And so I think that's the benefit of a book like this. It's kind of gives you the inside track on gaining perspective that you would not otherwise have, because it's not your lived experience. You have to have the opportunity to learn about it from someone who can share that with you. And that was a huge honor to be part of that process.
No kidding. Yeah. Yeah. If you haven't, it's hard to understand someone else's perspective unless you get an opportunity to walk, the proverbial mile in their shoes, to be able to even, position yourself. We can be sympathetic. We can be empathetic, but stories go such a long way in helping us actually, go beyond just oh, sure, I get that, to oh, wow, I got that.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I
think it's hard to, if you think about, I told you about the last chapter being what happens when you learn about these things. Well, first reaction is you feel kind of bad, right? And I write about this in the book. I actually had an interview with y'all back in, I don't know, 2017. And it was on when it was talking about mobile learning. This is how old this is. I think we were talking about like ebooks,
like when mLearn was a thing.
Email courses or something. Like it was something a long time ago. And I went back and I re-watched that recording and I said one of the most horrendous things. I used a terrible example, and I'm not going to say it again. You can go dig it up if y'all want to go look it up. But I think about things that I've said and done before that I wasn't thinking about it from that perspective. And I'm like, oh my goodness, why would you say that? But you don't think about it until you know. And so I think one of the things that's an opportunity here is when you learn about this stuff, start making changes going forward. Like, don't feel bad. Like, most people will say, oh, you're terrible because, you didn't think about accessibility. Give me a break. Like, how do you know what you don't know until you know it? And so once you know, then start making changes going forward. And that gives you the opportunity to grow and go on this journey and know that you'll still mess up sometimes, but it's making things better. And that's what I think I would like to see is the big takeaway from this book is could we create a world that's better?
Yeah. Accessibility is such, it's so layered, it's so multifaceted, etc. In the phrasing describing the book, it's the phrase that jumped out for me was adopt a progress over perfection approach, which, describes what you don't know what you don't know until someone, brings it forward to you. And then you have the opportunity to make things better because, there are just so many pieces of the equation. We'll talk to people and who, don't even think about contrast. I was looking at some content the other day and I thought, that's not good contrast, but it looks beautiful. But I there are going to be folks for whom that's not going to be a helpful, design that the team is working on. So.
Right. And I'm one of those people. I'm losing my vision, and I have been like even today. Right now, everything is very blurry, so I need to go back and check my glasses again. But I, as we get older, a lot of folks begin to lose their vision. Right? You begin to need glasses or contacts or whatever. A lot of folks lose mobility. It's a time game. Right? At some point, all of us or most of us will have some sort of disability. And I think that as we think about designing the world around us, could we make things more accessible to more people? The answer to that is absolutely, but everybody has to be on board. You have to learn about it. You have to know about it. And I think we should have design standards that dictate this is what being a good designer is. And if you haven't done XYZ, then your design's not done. You haven't finished yet, right? It's an incomplete design. And I think there are some checklist type things like color contrast and transcripts and captions and, making sure that you are checking for color blindness. So color's not the only indicator. Like there are some checklist things that we want to make sure that we're implementing broadly. And then there are some things where we have to leave the door open to have people let us know when they encounter a barrier and give them multiple ways to let us know that so that we can try to make sure that we're making sure that people do have access.
I think that's one of the challenges, people often I hear, and of course, when I first started, I thought this too, of accessibility is almost like a checklist. It's either there or it's not. But I think you talked about some items there, but I think back to instructional design or creating learning. It's not, you got a course. All courses, they're there or they're not. There's a very different levels of quality in courses, meeting the different types of needs there. And, you could have something that is very accessible for certain types of disabilities there, but not really touch on other ones. And I think you talked about, people can't do that job. I think people still think about that about any job out there. It's like, it's hard to gain that perspective that, yes, it can be done. I worked for an organization many years ago that they had, this is back when there's catalogs, but they had a huge catalog of things that people could buy to assist them doing things. Those are for people with disabilities. And of course, elderly as you get in, or injuries and stuff, there's all sorts of things. And then enable them to do things where you thought, oh, how could they have done that? Well, with this device, this reacher or whatever else, they were able to start doing different things. Of course, technology has really advanced too in that area, that yes, there might be some things, but as the environment that you're working in is adjusted, the lights are turned on, then we can actually see and do those things. And it's really something that you can't ignore in really almost any profession. I can't think of any that there couldn't be
Nope.
something in there that, yes, perhaps if they had disability X, that's a requirement there, but they could have another one that
Yeah.
not obvious. Just as you said, you look and you don't see that I don't see that your eyes are and your color contrast are looking at. I was reading a Dune comic, and it was a beautiful sand color in the background, and the text flowed with that there. But I thought to myself now, wow, that color contrast, if my eyes were, I would not be able to read this.
Mm-mm. That's right. And I think that there's a really good example. So, one of the things that the book advocates for is being more proactive in your design. So, instead of designing it and being like, oh, well, people can't use it, it's trying to be more proactive and think about personas, think about people ahead of time. Because we're designing for people. And I'm sorry, people are very different. And we have to start to think about what are the differences that we could design for to make things more accessible. Again, it's not saying that you will be 100% perfect necessarily, but there are very well documented processes and guidelines to help you identify what are some of the changes that you can make. And that's where this book comes in. I think one of the interesting things about like, what are the things you need to do? This book I consider to be a toolbox, but not in the way that some people might think, right? So you're not going to open it up and be like checklist 1, checklist 2. Now there are checklists in the back. There are lots of, processes that are documented in the back of the book as tools, the big T. But I think about this as being a toolbox because every single chapter, so there are 60 chapters, they're all very short. So when you read a chapter, it gives you a story, it gives you the lesson learned, and then it tells you one thing you can do right now. That is the tool. The book is the toolbox, right? So if you go through the book, by the time you're finished with this book, your whole practice will have changed. And I think it's really interesting that when we think about what are some of the things that we need to change to make things more accessible, when you start to think about it, it's almost like you can't shut it off. And Alexandria at ATD, who I worked on with the book from the very beginning, huge advocate for this book. One of the things that she talked about after working on this book, she was like, now I find examples everywhere. I see menus that aren't accessible. She even told me about a song she heard on the radio and she was like, this is not an inclusive song. And I said, Alexandria, I need you to calm down. But it's kind of like, there's a name for this where you, when you notice, like you buy a certain car and then you start seeing that car everywhere.
The cocktail effect.
What's that?
The layman from the psychology term is the cocktail effect.
Okay.
It comes from you're at a party and someone across the room yells you or says your name, not yells it. You'll hear that where you wouldn't have heard anything else. Or if you start looking for something, all of a sudden you see it everywhere. As soon as you decide that's not important, then that disappears like that company or whatever. It didn't change. It's just your awareness. Yeah.
Yeah. So you start to find examples everywhere and you realize how silly the environments are that are built around us and how little knowledge designers of built environments have about accessibility, which is weird because your entire job is to make sure that people can use the thing that you're making. Like that is your job. And there are folks like Don Norman in the UX world that, has talked about this. Design for All has come up in his work. I think that when we talk about designing, whether it's a physical environment, whether it's a digital environment, if your goal is that people can use it or do something with it, then you have to think about those people. And there's a really good comic illustration that has some snowy steps and a snowy ramp. And there's a person out shoveling the steps, and there are a bunch of kids waiting to go up the steps. And there's a kid that's a wheelchair user. And so he's shoveling these steps. And the kids were like, can you shovel the ramp? And he said, well, I've got to do the steps first, and then I'll do the ramp. And it's like, but everybody can use the ramp. But you have to think about that stuff up front because, everybody uses the curb cut example, right? Mm-hmm. The curb cuts on the sidewalk so that you can go over the curb and cross the street. If you have a stroller, if you use a wheelchair, whatever. So they're convenient for a whole bunch of people. Well, if you pour the concrete with the curb cut, you're going to save money because it's going to cost less concrete. I'm guessing. I don't do construction work. Maybe it costs the same or whatever. But pouring the curb cut probably doesn't cost anything extra because you're using less materials. If you go and cut the curb after the fact, it's going to be very expensive. And then making the curb cuts after the fact. So we think about being more proactive in design. It's how can I make sure that the most people possible that I can think of can access this thing. And again, this information is documented. You can do it as long as you're a good designer and you think about it, right? And that's what I'm hoping the message is, that learn about this stuff. This is not just, oh, I have somebody in my organization that is whatever. Well, first of all, you're not going to know all the people in your organization that have disabilities. You're just not. I interviewed people.
Know everyone. Anyway.
Oh my goodness. When I was working on this book, Sean on my team is colorblind. I had no idea. I have worked with Sean for a decade. I was just like, you're colorblind? He was like, yeah. I have people that I've met while working on this book that have told me, who have shared with me about their disabilities. I had no idea. And some of them were disabilities where I was like, how did I not know that? But people with disabilities have had to innovate. Mm-hmm. They've had to figure out how to work within very inaccessible environments, right? And it's not in your favor to speak up about it because you get berated. Oh, it's too expensive. Oh, you can't do this job. Oh, there's like all this stigma with it, right? Which is absurd. To your point earlier, Paul, about, well, you can't do this job if you're such and such, right? And having heard of this over the years, there's a chapter in the book that Diane Elkins writes about where this myth of people cannot do a job if they have a disability. Well, if you ask why can't they do this job, it's usually because of whatever structure you've set up for it. Like, you can't be an electrician if you're colorblind because the wires are this, and this color. Well, the problem is not the color blindness. The problem is that you didn't think about what color the wires were and giving another indicator on those wires, right? If you think about, I can't do this job because there are flights of stairs, or like you said, the reacher or whatever. It's like, well, why didn't you think about that ahead of time? Why didn't you think about all the different people that might work here and actually design that? Because most jobs don't require you. That's not even part of the job. Now, are there jobs that require you to have certain physical abilities? Like, I'm never going to play in the NBA, right? So, sure. But that is an excuse that is applied broadly. That is absurd. Like, that doesn't apply to everything. It actually doesn't apply to a whole lot of things. And so it's just an excuse.
There was in the chat, a good comment there from David there. That's not just about instructional designers, but also graphic designers, and kind of asking about, is this taught? And I was wondering, in your conversations with all those folks, have you, and I think at least I've seen that the instructional design has started to adopt this. I don't know how widely there. But was there any comments from folks, or did you find that people are learned graphic design? Because I know architecture is starting to, because of laws and stuff, bring that into their training. But have you, did you hear anything in your talks with folks in or outside the book?
Well, so I guess the thing that I have to be careful about here is, do I want to talk about the state of education in the United States, or do I want to talk about...
Well, that varies all across the United States, so I think that's fair.
It depends on different things, right? It depends on who your teacher is, what school you're going to, and like where you got your education from, because different programs are very, very different, right? And how people approach teaching things is very different. So yes, some programs are teaching different elements to a certain degree. Most people talk about it more from a usability perspective than they do from an accessibility perspective. Those two things are slightly different, although better accessibility means better usability. But when we think about like design programs and instructional design, I will say when I started working on this book, it was a fight to talk about it at conferences, because the conference folks were like, people don't care about this. And I said, yes, they do. Yes, they do. And they were, it's not AI or it's not whatever. But one of the things that I've talked to conference organizers about is that it's not an accessibility session. all of your sessions should have something, not necessarily all of them, but most of your sessions should have something about how do you also make this accessible to people, right? And thinking about if you're going to teach people how to use, I don't know, a tool to do a certain thing, and how is that making sure that it's accessible to everyone? So it's more baking it into the things that we do. If, I'm talking at ATD at the international conference, that's this month in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks.
And I'm talking about accessibility with AI and accessibility and inclusion, and like, can AI support it? What are some of the things to pay attention to and be careful of? And what are some of the things that AI powered tools are very good for? So, it's part of the discussion. It's not an accessibility track. It's accessibility and all the things that we're doing, right? How is this being used by actual real people? It's like the question. And not just people with a certain disability, but people in general. How are people going to use this thing?
So speaking of, I was wondering, could you share a short tip of in advance for those folks who won't be going to ATD of what's an example of where AI seems like it could help out in this area?
Captions and transcripts. I've been using a tool called Descript for this. Some folks also use Otter AI. I've used that as well. But I've been using Descript for like 8+ years. I stopped counting years because I have no concept of time anymore since probably the pandemic. But I've been using Descript for a long time, and it's AI powered. So it allows you to drop in a video, drop in an audio file. It pops in the transcript. You can go in and just edit it. The editing tools are fast. There are even AI editing tools in there where you can like remove filler words, clean up certain things. So it works super, super well. So I can make sure that I have a caption file and a transcript file in a couple minutes. It's so simple.
And is it the AI, because you've been doing this for a while, as the AI just improve the quality and speed of that? Is that kind of what
in some ways? I will say in the last year, I don't know if it's this race to AI everything, but I think things have actually gotten worse in the last year. I don't know what's happening with vendors that are doing AI stuff, but there are some things that aren't as good. But I would say as a whole, like automated captions have really improved significantly in many tools. I use at presentations, I use PowerPoint. I use their automatic captions during my presentations. If y'all didn't know this, you already have automatic captions in PowerPoint. You just turn it on. And so if you're presenting a session or if you're presenting a workshop or a class, you just turn on the captions and they're automated. And the Microsoft PowerPoint closed captions are actually quite good. The live captions, they're not perfect, but they are very, very good. I have not had a lot of problems. Whereas there are other tools like Zoom's captioning is horrendous. Like Zoom's auto captioning is horrible. So it just kind of depends on the tool, and your mileage may vary.
Yeah. And speaking of, we have a question in there from David about tool set there. I think all the answer is your mileage may vary, and all tools are looking to be, well, I don't know if they're looking to, but probably looking to be better. But he's wondering, have you found some common or issues in rapid authoring tools that seem to fall short when you're researching the book? Comment, or do you just need to learn JavaScript? And I'm thinking in a lot of cases, even if you knew JavaScript, that might not help you with some of those things. But
yeah, I have probably a little bit of an unpopular opinion, but let me talk through it. So I believe that if you are an e-learning developer, that you really do need to learn basics on code. Like you need to learn something about HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and probably a little bit about ARIA, which is what allows the code to be more accessible. And so I think that it is helpful to learn some code basics because it can help you understand when something's off. And it also helps. I mean, if you're creating e-learning, you're basically making mini websites. That's what you're doing. And so if you think about the skill set that you really should have to do that, you should understand how code works. You should understand what, HTML5 is and how it's structured. Those are some things that I think that you should understand. Now, that being said, when we get into accessibility, understanding how code works, when you are able to make code more accessible, it makes things more accessible to people, right? But it's also making things more accessible to robots. So good, clean, accessible code is something that you're going to have. If you're in an organization that's like, we're going to do AI all the time, you need to figure out your accessibility, because things that make things accessible to humans are the things that make things accessible to robots. And so you have to understand robots are not going to read, your e-learning visuals. You have no alt text on them. Now there is OCR and stuff like that, and things are getting better. So your mileage may vary. Captioning on YouTube, I do not do auto captioning on YouTube. I find it to be not good because it does not include any punctuation or capitalization. And so, or randomly does. So it's like just this long stream, no speaker identification. So, is it better to have it turned on? Yes, turn on all your captioning defaults. That is step one. Making sure that they're accurate captions is super, super important. And especially if you're doing anything from a training perspective, because so Jane Bozarth shared an example with me. This has been last year while I was working on the book. She was working on a project, and a video, the captioning was about a grease fire, putting out a grease fire. And the captions were wrong. And it said to put water on the grease fire instead of do not put water on the grease fire. From a training perspective, that is a huge problem, right? And so we have to make sure, especially from a training perspective, that captions are accurate. Can you get by with less accurate captions for some things? Maybe. My question is, do you want to? Do you want people to misunderstand what you said? Because it's not just folks that are, deaf or hard of hearing that are using captioning. It's the vast majority of people, and especially at different times. I turn them on all the time now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very cool. That is probably an awesome tip and a conversation to close ourselves out on. Sarah, you mentioned you're at ATD and you've got a session there.
Yes.
If folks are going to ATD, they can obviously drop into the bookstore. Do you have a book signing time slot?
I do. So my session is Monday, which I think is like the first regular day of the conference.
Actually, it's Sunday's the first regular day.
Is it?
Yeah,
okay. I thought that was like pre-conference stuff. So, it's not on Sunday. On Monday, I have a super session in the afternoon. And you'd have to look at the app or on my website at buildcapable.com. I think it's posted there too. But I have a session in the afternoon, and then I have my book signing in the bookstore right after. So I would love to meet up with folks, whether you buy the book or not. I do have some cards that Cassie, who's also in the book, printed out. And so for folks that don't want to haul this book back from the conference and want to buy it online, I can sign a card or just chat with you about accessibility and inclusion in the book and in the process. That'd be great.
Fabulous.
Cool. Oh, one thing I do want to share is that we do have a free book club starting at the end of this month. And it goes over, I believe it's 7 or 8 weeks, because 4th of July is in there. So there's 1 week where it's off, but it's every Friday. Starting on May 30th, maybe it's the end of this month. And you can register for that at designforallbook.com. And it's free. And if you want to just join, if you have the book, it's perfect, because you just read a part of the book and then we'll talk about it. And we read a part of the book and we'll talk about it. And even if you don't read that whole part, even if you just read a few chapters, that is perfect for book club. But even if you haven't gotten the book, you could still come and hang out and learn something. So that book club is absolutely free, and we'll be hosting that on Zoom.
Very cool. Zoom, but the captions provided elsewhere.
We will record them. Yes. So what I do with Zoom is I record them, and then I post-produce them in Descript, because there's a little plugin so that an integration where I can edit those. And then I will get those recordings posted. Probably, I think we're posting them to YouTube. So that way they'll have the captions and transcripts on YouTube.
Awesome. All right. Hey, Sarah, thanks as always for joining us. What a wickedly awesome conversation. Such an important thing that, it's one of our more frequent topics when I think back about the number of, the categories of things. We always seem to keep coming back to it. It's always been also more of a journey than a
yes.
singular thing as well. That whole concept of start somewhere, keep making things better as you go along. Hey, gang, it's time to dance on out of here. Thanks so much to everybody for joining us, for listening here today.